Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fifth episode of the Sfarim Chatter Sabbetai Tzvi series. On this episode of the series, I was joined once again by Professor Matt Goldish, and we picked up where we left off in the last episode, which was to discuss Sabbetai Tzvi after the conversion, what the belief and the theology was around that, and then after his death in 1676, and again, historically what happened and the theology and belief in him. We continued past that, some figures and some stories that went on after that as well. I will mention here that, first of all, thank you everyone for any feedback that I've gotten. I appreciate all the feedback on the series especially. And if anyone has any questions or comments about the series, especially as it relates to, I guess, the first two episodes, I did these two episodes with Professor Goldish, but even around the other ones or just in general questions about Sabbataism, you can email me, let me know, sfarimchatter@gmail.com. Professor Goldish has been gracious enough to agree to come back for a third episode to just tie things up if there were things that we missed. I mean, of course there are, and there's going to be other guests on the series as well, continuing. But I just want to mention that. So if anyone has any things in particular that they feel like after these two and listening, and then, of course, the other episodes that we didn't get to, please let me know. Once again, I want to thank the corporate sponsor of the series, Gluck Plumbing, for all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division, from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines, to a simple faucet leak. Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. That's 732-523-1836, extension 1. And once again, for any feedback, comments, or to support the podcast, to sponsor an episode, please email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. In this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Matt Goldish, who is the Samuel M. and Esther Melton Chair in Jewish History at Ohio State University. And we'll be discussing, this will be the second part of our Sabbetai Tzvi podcast, which is related to Sabbetai Tzvi following the conversion until his death and after that as well. So, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Goldish, for joining me once again.
Happy to be here.
So we did discuss in the last episode until the conversion, but I guess let's just quickly recap Sabbetai Tzvi's, the conversion, where it took place and what happened, and then we will move on from there.
So Sabbetai had been imprisoned by the Ottoman government in Gallipoli, and by paying off the guards and doing those things that were typical, he turned it into what amounted to a visitor center. So instead of it looking like a prison, it looked like it was his headquarters. And Jews from all over the Mediterranean and Europe came to visit him there and check him out and get a sense of who he was and so on, including famous visitors, the son and son-in-law of the Taz, which I can't remember if we talked about that last time. We did. Okay. The movement was at its height in July and August of 1666, and a visitor from Lviv showed up, Nehemiah HaKohen, and it is not quite clear what his program or what his agenda was, but he went in private to talk with Sabbetai, and he apparently talked to him for a couple of days straight, probably taking time out for meals. And he had some kind of huge disagreement with him. Maybe it was about what the messianic status of Nehemiah himself was. Maybe it was about whether all the Kabbalistic defense of Sabbetai was appropriate. Not clear what it was, but in short, Nehemiah comes out from this yeshivos with Sabbetai. He tells the guards that he wants to become a Muslim, which turns out to be very simple to do. he denounces Sabbetai, and he leaves back to Poland, where he returns to his regularly scheduled Jewish life. Apparently, the Ottoman court was in Edirne or Adrianople at this time. Guards come from Edirne. They arrest Sabbetai Tzvi. It sounds odd to us to arrest somebody who's already in prison, but that's what they did, and they take him to Edirne. And this is in September of 1666, September 15th. He is brought before the Divan, Kopulu, and before the Sultan, and he's asked what he has to say for himself. That people have been reporting that he has announced himself to be the king of the Jews or the Messiah of the Jews, and what does he have to say? And he denies being the Messiah of the Jews. He's apparently at this time in one of his low states. I'm a complete believer in Sholom's thesis that he was bipolar, and he was apparently at a low state at this point. And he's standing there, and the government, right, the Divan is deciding, whether to just go ahead and cut his head off, as you would, right, or what to do. And there is a Jewish apostate, a former Jew who is now Muslim, who is the physician of the Sultan, and he's standing there, and he apparently sort of whispers into Sabbatai's ear that, well, why don't you go ahead and save yourself and convert to Islam? My guess is that everybody involved was well aware of the Rambam's position about this type of situation, and Sabbatai goes ahead and converts to Islam. Now, if you know stuff about the history of messiahs and messianism, that's never what they do. You always martyr yourself, right? You allow them to kill you, and then you become this huge figure, and a religion builds around you, and right, and so on. That's not what he did. He converted to Islam. He got a Muslim name. He got a stipend from the Sultan, and he was considered a sort of celebrity convert. And they hoped that he would bring lots of Jews over into Islam with him. Well, he brought some, and over the next few years, he brought about 200 families in Edirne into Islam with him. And apparently it was a sort of semi-open secret that he and these people, while practicing Islam in public, still held on to a lot of Jewish practices in private, and maybe some other stuff also having to do with beliefs in Sabbatai being the Messiah. My sense, and maybe if you talk to Mark Baer or somebody else who's an expert on this, they can tell you more, but my sense is that Islam, over 1,000 years that it had existed, was kind of accustomed to people converting to Islam, which requires a very simple statement of faith, sort of bringing with them other practices, other ideas, and that they weren't real doctrinaire about that. So they sort of let Sabbatai go in this way, and he continued to kind of preach his own faith to his believers. He lived in Edirne and in Constantinople. Again, that is what Jews continue to call the city that became Istanbul. They continue in their literature always to call it Constantinople, Kushta. Anyway, he lived in these two cities, which were the seats of Ottoman government for a number of years, for about 6 years. In 1672, a group of Jews, Muslims, denounced him to the government again and said that he's not being a proper Muslim. And by the way, also, and there is very good reason to believe that this was the case, that there were a lot of, let's call it inappropriate gender practices. How's that? Going on with Sabbetai and among his group. Just as an example, he divorced his wife, he arranged to marry somebody else, and then he remarried the wife. But that's not really what we're talking about. There was all kinds of stuff going on. Anyway, some money was apparently paid to the Ottoman government too, and Sabbetai was rearrested and he was sent into exile in Albania in 1672. Nathan of Gaza came to visit him, both back in Turkey and then in Albania, a number of times. Samuel Primo, who had been his secretary, came to visit him. And Avram Hayachini, who was one of the great, brilliant rabbis who was a follower. So he continued to see these people. He sort of went back and forth between being an ardent Muslim and preaching his own faith. Very, very hard to put a finger on what he actually thought, if there was any one thing. And eventually in 1676, on Yom Kippur, he all of a sudden keeled over and died. I should go back a step. His wife, Sarah, had died in 1674, and we know something about her. There's a small book by Dr. van der Helden about Sarah that was published in the Netherlands. I think he's contemplating a larger book. Anyway, so she died and he remarried. He married a woman named Esther. In some sources, she's referred to as Yocheved, but I think her actual name was Esther. She was the daughter of Rabbi Joseph Philosophe of Saloniki, Salonika. He was a major rabbi. He was related to a whole bunch of other major rabbis, and this marriage, was really important for the future of the movement in Salonika. Philosophe was a big believer in Sabbetai Tzvi, and everybody in his circle was. So that is kind of the short version of the story up until Sabbetai dies. Nathan of Gaza died in 1680, right at the beginning of the year, and then Avram Hayashimi died in 1682.
So obviously we're going to go back now that we have the basic, understanding of what went on there. So I think I actually saw in your an article that you published fairly recently. You made mention to this how what happens to such movements that just collapse, prophetic messianic movements. What exactly happens to the movements and then to the followers? And I think that's very important to bring up here, as we obviously will discuss the fallout and the continued belief in him and who did and who changed their mind. But I think just first of all, just to discuss broadly and overall, I mean, what happens to such movements in general and, what happened in this case?
Okay, so I'll say a couple things about that. The very first thing has to do with something that we talked about last time, which is that Kabbalah played a huge part in the entire picture. It played a huge part in the reason that people believed in Sabbetai to begin with, especially rabbis, in the complicated theology of the movement. And especially after his apostasy and after his death, it was an enormous piece of why people continued to believe in him. And it's very difficult to explain, but people often think of rational philosophy, the philosophy of the Rambam, as being theologically problematic in Judaism. The ideas of the Rambam considered heresy by various people, and so on. The ideas of the Kabbalah seem to get a pass. Well, Kabbalah, right? Probably because the Kabbalists were extremely dedicated to the practice of the mitzvos and the detailed ideas about what they mean. But the ideas of the Kabbalists from the 13th century until the period we're studying, the 17th century, they had put forward some highly problematic ideas, I would say, from the point of view of traditional Jewish theology, if there is such a thing. There were some very strange ideas in there. And they all sort of came to the surface in this movement. And I would add that there are some strange ideas in Tanakh. It's some strange descriptions of what our ancestors did under various circumstances. And there are lots of very sort of strange ideas buried in the Medrash and the Agada of the Talmud. And the Sabbateans were able to kind of round up all this material and shape a coherent Kabbalistic and Midrashic theology out of it that was very convincing to a lot of people and continued to be convincing. So that's the very first thing that I want to say. Second thing is I want to bring up something that you and I talked about earlier, this famous book from the 1950s by a group of social scientists called When Prophecy Fails, Festinger et al. This book is a book really about, this is the book that coins the term cognitive dissonance. It talks about what happens to people when all their eggs are in one basket, when they believe in a prophecy or prophetic movement, and the prophecy doesn't come true. As an interesting book because the authors actually join a prophetic movement that's going on in their time. Among the examples that they give is actually the Sabbatean movement, Shabtaut. But Sholom's book had not come out in English when they published their book. And so all they knew was a small amount of material that was available in English and European languages. And they used an outdated version of the Sabbetai Tzvi story. But they still are absolutely correct that the Sabbatean movement fits their model perfectly. And here's what they say happens in these movements. The first thing that happens is that of the concentric circles of believers in any given movement, the outer circles, the less dedicated believers, fall away. The prophecy fails and they leave the movement disillusioned. But of the hardcore, the inner core of believers, not only do those people continue to believe, they redouble their efforts, right? What is it they say now? They double down, right? They get more intense about their beliefs. They recalculate, they rejigger the prophecy, they do whatever they have to do. This is where the cognitive dissonance comes in. And not only that, but they then go and proselytize and go to bring in more people into the faith. So it's completely not what you would expect, but they have documented this happening in movements over and over again. So that's a second piece. And that is exactly what happens with the Sabbateans. Most people abandon the movement, but there is a hardcore of believers, among whom are many rabbis, and they not only continue the faith, they seek to expand it. A third thing that I want to say is that when you study messianic movements of any religion, you see that there are certain patterns of how people react when their prophecy fails. There are certain responses, and you see them over and over. Christianity is the av tipus. Christianity is the archetype for explaining failed messianic movements. Jesus comes, as far as I can tell, the world has not been redeemed. How are you going to explain that? So they invent the idea of the apotheosis. Well, he seems to have died. He didn't exactly die, and he's coming back. So they split the movement into two parts. The first part in which he did some stuff, and then there's going to be the later part in which he finishes the job. You definitely see that with the Sabbateans all over the place. Then is the idea of occultation, that the Messiah, in the case of Jesus, right, Lahavdil Elef Alfei Havdalas, in the case of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, right, and so on, didn't die. They are occulted somewhere. They have been hidden, usually in a mountain somewhere, or up in heaven, or in some special place, and that's where they are, and they're coming back. And we know about the role of Enosh and Eliyahu Hanavi in these moments, because these are the two people in Tanakh who never died. So they're occulted somewhere, wherever it is. They will show up to usher in the Mashiach. So definitely have that. And in Sabbateanism, it has its own special twists about what this means. So the most important versions of this are the versions that are taught by Nathan of Gaza on the one hand, and Abraham Miguel Cardoso on the other hand, the two sort of major theologians of the movement. So Nathan of Gaza gets the news in November of 1666, and he immediately says, this is a big secret, there's something going on here, Kabbalistic meaning and so on. And he teaches the following idea. Sabbetai Tzvi has been fighting with the Sitra Achra all the time. That's been his mission. And these strange things that he does, the Ma'asim Zarim, right? The Averot and the changing dates and, all these things that he does, it's all part of his fight against the Sitra Achra. And now is the ultimate moment in his fight against the Sitra Achra. All of the Nitzotzot, the holy sparks of Kedusha, have been gathered from everywhere in the world. And so everything is sort of laid out for the Mashiach to come. But there are still some Nitzotzot, some holy sparks buried among the Klipot, right? So if we know the basics of Luriana Kabbalah, right, this realm of the Klipot, of the husks of unholiness that are everywhere after the divine catastrophe in creation. So Sabbetai Tzvi has to, like a secret agent, I don't know, like James Bond, right? He's got to sneak his way into the world of the Klipot in order to rescue those last few Nitzotzot of Kedusha. And he does that by converting to Islam, which everybody is going to see as an apostasy, a horrible, how could he, and so on, and everybody will reject him. But meanwhile, he is there in the realm of the Klipot, gathering up those last Nitzotzot of Kedusha, and he's going to pop back up. Those Nitzotzot are going to return to their source in God, and it's going to save the world. Cardoso is super interesting. Cardoso is a converso. He's a Marranim. He was born in Spain as a Christian, a descendant of Jews, right? But he was born into a Catholic world, and he lived there until adulthood. And he's highly trained in Christian theology and philosophy and so on. And he comes out and he converts back to his ancestral Judaism. And he's clearly an incredible genius, as is Nathan of Gaza. He is a theologian of the movement as well. And his approach is that he actually says this. He says, the Mashiach is destined to become a converso, like me. He actually says this, like me, right? He has to convert. His idea is somewhat similar to Nathan's, although he vehemently denies Nathan's whole theology. But it's got this sort of formal similarity, right? That the Mashiach has to be reviled by the Jewish people. He has to do that by becoming a converso. He has to leave Judaism and go become this person who is hated and reviled for his abandonment of his people. And only then, right, can he come back and bring everything back together. So these are theologies of the conversion of Sabbetai, which these two brilliant Sabbatean theologians are teaching, and it's enough for people. People are looking for a reason to keep believing. So most people abandon the movement when Sabbetai converts to Islam, especially after he dies. As I said last time, it's very difficult to explain a non-Jewish, dead Jewish Messiah. So most people abandon the movement, but there was this hardcore, and this was what they needed. They needed a theological, philosophical explanation which would allow them to continue to believe. It's really mostly a psychological point, right? Their eggs are all in one basket. They put everything into this, and they really are unable to believe that this could possibly not be the real thing.
And even more odd is the one I think you alluded to, where you said with the belief where even though he died, you're like, no, the Messiah is just hiding, etc. So here he converts, he doesn't actually die. So it's like that person walking around in the turban is someone else. Sabbetai is hiding in heaven or some weird, right? Some weird take on that theology that they have, which I don't even understand. Is that true? That's also what somehow.
Well, I think until he died, the idea was that he's on some kind of secret Kabbalistic mission in the world of the Klipot. So he looks like this Muslim guy who's walking around, going to the mosque, and he's hanging around a lot, by the way, with Sufis, with Muslim mystics, whose ideas are amazingly similar to those of the Kabbalists in a lot of cases, and their practices. One of Pavel's students has done brilliant work, Feldman, right, in this area, unbelievable work. Anyway, so as long as he's alive, he is right. He's on a secret mission. Once he's dead, then it's easier to explain that he's not really dead. He's occulted. Right. And if anybody thinks that it's hard to believe, right, how would people possibly believe that the Messiah could still be alive when he died? Well, you don't have to look far for people who believe that. Anyway.
So, right. So now, I mean, something like you mentioned, the ones on the outside fell away and the ones in the middle stayed in. I think something that, I mean, I guess we can approach this two ways. But I guess the first thing is that maybe listeners would be curious about is, rabbinic figures. Obviously, Rabbanim, there were many that believed in him. Did they all immediately just turn around and change their mind? And we'll get to the masses in a minute, but did the rabbinic figures just change their mind? Or were there some that continued to believe in him until death and then post-death?
I would say, and I made this argument in a recent article that I think you read today, that it was specifically rabbis who stayed with it. Ordinary Jews, even relatively learned ones, could not penetrate the Kabbalistic arguments of Nathan and Cardoso and Yachini and these figures who were explaining what was going on with Sabbetai. And they couldn't have been, in most cases, dedicated to Sabbateanism, to the faith in Sabbetai, in the same way as a rabbi could, who understood what the Zohar had to say about the Mashiach, who knew what the Rambam had to say about the Mashiach, which was amazingly twisted by Nathan of Gaza brilliantly, if I may say, to reflect on Sabbetai positively, right? Only rabbis really had the tools to buy in at the full strength of the movement. And therefore, it was lots of rabbis, and people have said, secondary elite. Moshe Idel is famous for this idea about secondary rabbinic elite. So some people have said, well, it's sort of the secondary level of rabbis who bought in or who remained dedicated. Well, no, it wasn't. It's hard for us today because and I think that we've discussed this, maybe we talked about it last time, we have the standard rabbinic bookshelf, so we know who's an important rabbi because their books are still, right, their Sfarim, this is the Sfarim chatter, right? So their Sfarim are still being chattered about, right? Their Sfarim are still being reprinted and so on. But that's not the way that it works historically. There are these enormous figures that 100 years later, nobody's heard of, but in their own time, they are massive rabbinic luminaries. And if they didn't publish a sefer, or if their sefer was sort of not republished or not noticed and didn't become part of the standard bookshelf, well, we've sort of forgotten about them. But there were major figures who not only were believers in Sabbetai at the height of the movement, but continued to believe in him afterwards. And as you know, among my favorite figures to discuss in that context, the greatest Kabbalist in Italy and afterwards in Amsterdam was Rabbi Moshe Zacuto. And Rabbi Moshe Zacuto had a number of outstanding students, but probably his two most outstanding students were Rabbi Avraham Rovigo, and Rabbi Binyamin HaKohen Vitali, later of Reggio Emilia. These were two huge Talmidei Chachamim of the period in Italy, and Chacham Zacuto may have been interested in Sabbetai Tzvi for a while, but rejected the movement certainly after the apostasy. But his two students became the two leading Italian Sabbateans of the later 17th century. And it becomes even more important because one of the, let me see if I can get this straight. The son-in-law of Rabbi Binyamin HaKohen was Rabbi Yeshaya Basan. Rabbi Yeshaya Basan was the teacher of the Ramchal. And when the Ramchal came forward with or it became recognized outside his immediate circle that he had a Magid, right, this heavenly mentor who was talking to him, one of the first people that he discussed it with was Rabbi Binyamin HaKohen, who became a huge supporter of the Ramchal. And this became a huge problem for Rabbi Moshe Chasid and the other opponents of the Ramchal, because he was this huge Talmid Chacham and this highly respected, pious figure, this Rabbi Binyamin HaKohen. But he was a Sabbatean, dedicated, right? So there are lots more examples of major figures from the period who not only were believers during the height of the movement, but continued to be believers afterwards.
Interestingly, about Binyamin HaKohen, also known now, maybe people have seen his the acronym, Rabach. Interestingly, talking about Svarim chatter, there have been stuff printed from him recently. Zichron Aaron has printed a Perek Shira with his commentary, and of David Oppenheim and others. And then they've also included his notes, I think, in Carbon Aaron. I think it's in Taras Kanim. And I think in other places, and there's no mention. Obviously, people don't know. I know Elisheva Kabach discusses him in her book, and Ramesh Chagiz, I know he is discussed there as a Sabbatean. I mean, yeah, and discussing the Ramchal you mentioned, I'll refer listeners to my podcast with David Sklar about the Ramchal, where we did discuss that, and that is absolutely the case. So yes, and then another figure that we will, I'm sure, discuss later on is Yehuda Chasid, otherwise known as from the Chorva Shul, the Chas, that people are familiar with, and we'll get to that a little later. So. And we did discuss on the last episode about this whole thing with what is a famous rabbinic figure. But
I just want to say one other thing, in case anybody should doubt that the Rabbah was a Sabbatean. He had a picture of Sabbetai Tzvi hanging up in his house.
And how do we know that?
Sholem says it. I don't know who told Sholem. In other words, I don't know where he read it, but he read it from an eyewitness. And
I seem to recall, I don't remember if it's Professor Kalbach says or someone else, that he has a work written about Sabbatean theology. He has something in manuscript. I don't remember where I saw that, somewhere. But, right.
We have letters of his, especially with Rovigo. There was a very robust correspondence because they were best friends, very close friends. And Rovigo left a lot of manuscript works, and then other people had copies of letters. And the letters that they exchanged, it is very clear that he was deeply involved with Rovigo's base medrash, in which lots of Sabbatean activity was going on.
So we'll I guess revisit Rovigo and the others in a few minutes. But I think just to finish up this part is, what was the reaction overall? I mean, you mentioned a lot of the general population and the people on the outside just fell off. But I mean, what was the reaction? There was the Ottoman Empire, Italy, and then you had Poland and Amsterdam and Germany. I mean, what was the reaction in various places, and was it the same? And what was just what happened there?
So really, it's very odd how mixed the reaction was and how uneven. So the rabbis of communities, right, you can imagine that rabbis whose responsibility it is to create a stable Jewish community, to make sure that there is a fundraiser to build a new shul and have a new Sefer Torah written, and they are looking at the long term and so on, right? Throughout Jewish history, those people who are responsible for the sort of establishment Jewish community are at odds with people who are all about the Mashiach, because if people think the Mashiach is about to come or has already come or is in the process of coming or something like that, they're not going to be interested in building a new Talmud Torah or buying Sfarim for the shul library or something. They're abandoning everything. Some of them are quitting their jobs and selling their stuff to move to Yerushalayim, right? These two things are at odds with each other throughout Jewish history. Lionel Kachin has written an interesting little book about that. But that's what happens now also. When Sabbetai Tzvi converts to Islam, the leaders of Jewish communities, the first thing that they do is they go back to the Pinkas of the Kehillah, and they cut the pages out that contain all the discussions about what people were doing when they thought that Sabbetai Tzvi was Mashiach. So literally, many of the primary sources that we might be able to use about what went on at the height of the movement have been physically cut out of the community notebooks and so on. The communal leaders come down very hard on the movement, and they officially declare that nobody can participate, and they make announcements about nobody should be learning Kabbalah below the age of 40, and all this type of thing. And yet, in almost every Ottoman community, in almost every Italian community, in almost every North African community, and probably in many Polish communities, there are strong groups of believers. Some of them are really underground. Some of them are not so much underground. Some of the rabbis who lead communities are believers. Some of those rabbis are really underground about their beliefs, like Shmuel Primo, who became the rabbi in Edurne. He said that nobody should know, right? You should keep it totally underground. And some of them were pretty open about their belief, like the Rabbach with his picture of Sabbetai on the wall. And right, and then everything in between. So, for example, Rav Avraham Rovigo is careful about who he opens up to, and yet he opens up to quite a number of people about his Sabbatean beliefs. So there's everything in between, and it's the same thing with ordinary people, right? There are lots of people who continue to believe, some of them more hidden, some of them less so. The communities also differ. You'll have a community that's full of believers right next to a community that comes out very strongly against the believers. Mostly that tends to be the leadership more than the ordinary people, but it looks very uneven. It's very hard to kind of see why one community is full of people who continue to believe and another is less so, and so on. One of the factors that influences that is, for example, where Nathan of Gaza goes to visit. So he spends a lot of time in Saloniki. Saloniki is a center of believers, both those who stay Jewish and those who convert to Islam in the 1680s. He visits Castoria. That community has a strong group of believers. He visits Izmir. That community has a strong group of believers, and they also have a rabbi who's a Sabbatean. So it's very uneven.
Right. Now, I mean, another thing that's related to this is, I think, first of all, this whole discussion thing is in Sholom's book, and the eighth and ninth, seventh and eighth chapters. It is, I think, where why was it that a lot of them, like you said, you mentioned there, you alluded to, they did keep it quiet, so to speak. They didn't go around saying that they were believers. Was there a reason? Is that what was there a specific reason that was the case?
Well, the first thing is that some communities at different points put a cherem on first on Nathan of Gaza, and then on Cardoso. Cardoso kept getting thrown out of one community after another. Another important point about this is that the theology of the movement became more and more radical as the movement moved from an open public movement into a sort of underground movement. People did not want the Ottoman government to know that there were still believers, of course, because this was a political hot potato, right? It looked like they were rising up against the Ottoman government, like they wanted to overthrow the Ottomans and return to Jewish power in the land of Israel and so on, right? So it's politically charged. But also Sabbetai and the people in his circle, Shmuel Primo in his circle, and then Baruch Russo among the Dolmeh and certain other figures started teaching a highly radicalized version of Sabbatean theology. So it starts probably with Sabbetai himself, with something called his Raza de Mehem Musa. And he teaches the following idea, that there are really, right, there's the Ein Sof, there's the unknowable God, and then there's Elokei Israel, there's the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, and they're not the same. And the God of the Bible is the one who does everything, and the unknowable Ein Sof is really kind of irrelevant, but they're different. And in fact, in this book, he teaches a sort of a three-part idea of God, that there's Atika Kadisha, and then, right, so there's the Ein, essentially it works like this. There's the Ein Sof, and then there's Elokei Israel, the God of Israel, and then there's the Shechina. So there are actually three parts. So as the theology is getting stranger, as people are beginning to treat Sabbetai Tzvi himself as if he is a deity, and later Baruch Russo is treated as if he's a deity, as you'll excuse me, the sexual shenanigans are getting out of, right, are happening and becoming known, and so on, right? So there's heresy, and there's political danger, and there are these practices which are just embarrassing for people. The community tries to hush it up. Most people would be embarrassed to let it be known publicly that they are participants. And the official kind of communal approach is to try and brush all of it under the rug and pretend that it never happened. So somebody who would come out publicly and announce that they are participants in this movement would really be they would really be prejudicing themselves and risking being possibly in some cases put in cherem and put on the margins of the community. Not always, but in many cases.
So a big part that we haven't really discussed much of, we've mentioned little, is Nathan of Gaza himself. You alluded to that he visited Salonika and he was in elsewhere. I mean, what happened to him once, Shabtai converts, and then, and then we mentioned what he believed, his theology. So that part, but where was his movements and what exactly? Obviously, he interestingly never converted to Islam.
No. So the leading figures felt very strongly, right? Hayachini and Nathan, and especially Cardoso, they felt very strongly that it is for the Mashiach, it's for Shabtai to convert and do whatever his mission is. It is not for them to convert. And they stay not only Jewish, but very, very dedicated mitzvah observers, if I could put it that way. That is not true of all the Jewish figures, right? The believers who stayed within Judaism. There are some people who become antinomians. Sorry. Yeah. Right. So there are some people who become radicalized and break all kinds of mitzvot in a ritual way, which is a whole different story. But Nathan does not teach that. And so what does he do? Well, he gets the news. He heads out to go to Sabbetai in a Dirne, right? That's his first move. It's like, I got to go talk to him. I got to go find out what happened and what the meaning is and so on. And he's heading there. And the rabbis of Constantinople, who are very strong opponents, right? Once Sabbetai has apostatized, they stop Nathan, and then later he's trying again, and no, he actually he does go. He ends up going, even though he stopped the first time. He goes, and Sabbetai sends him on a mission to go to Rome and to do some kind of tikkun in Rome. Now, this is something that Jewish messiahs do. You'll remember that Jesus, who is an early Jewish messiah you might have heard of, he had a deep involvement with the Romans, but he didn't have to go to Rome to do that because the Romans were in Eretz Yisrael. Then Abraham Abulafia went to Rome. So the Gemara says that the Mashiach is in Rome, right? The famous story. They ask Eliyahu Hanavi, when's the Mashiach coming? He says, oh, he's already here. He's standing at the gates of Rome with the lepers, right? So we know Mashiach is in Rome, right? So So Avraham Abulafia goes to Rome. Then David Haruveni goes on a mission to Rome, and then Shlomo Molcho goes to Rome. So it's a Jewish Messiah thing to do, go to Rome. Aliyah Regel, I don't know, whatever. So Nathan of Gaza goes to Rome at the behest of Sabbetai, and he does whatever tikkun, and it's on his way there, on his way back, that he's grabbed by the rabbis of Venice, and they grill him, and they basically force him to recant and to declare that he no longer believes and that he is not going to see any more of Sabbetai and all of this, and they hold on to that. He shows up later again in Venice in the 1670s at Pesach time one year, and he starts, right. He's teaching Shabtaut. He's teaching all this stuff, and the rabbis of Venice publish a booklet with their interview with Nathan, in which he recants everything. He promises he'll stop and so on, and they publish that, and Nathan rejects it. He says it's not true, none of it, or I said it under force, or whatever it is. And he continues his activities. He has to leave Italy, as you can imagine. He goes back to the Balkans, to the Ottoman Empire, and he spends the rest of his life there. And he goes from one community to another community, especially Saloniki, Izmir, and Castoria, and certain other places where he spends a lot of time. Eventually, he dies in Turkey and Macedonia. And all this time, he's going from one place to another, and he's developing his theology in more detail, and he's teaching people. So, for example, in Saloniki, he apparently, at least for a very short time, taught a couple of young students. Their names are Rabbi Shlomo Ayallon and Rabbi Eliyahu Mojajon. These two young guys, right? They're maybe in their early teens at the time when he's there. And he teaches them, and they become lifelong dedicated Sabbateans. And even though you didn't ask, I'm going to tell you about these two guys because they are important Talmidim of Nathan of Gaza from this period. What do they go on to do? Shlomo Ayallon, about whom I've written a number of essays, he goes to stay with. So first of all, it appears he joins the Donmeh. He converts to Islam in the 1680s with the Donmeh. I won't go into what happens with him while he's in that group, but let's just say he didn't come out with the same wife that he went in with. I'll leave it at that. Okay. But he leaves eventually. He abandons the group and goes back to Judaism. He does what was probably a good idea for somebody who had done that, and he leaves Saloniki, he leaves the Ottoman Empire, and goes to Italy. He spends time in the Beit Midrash of Avraham Rovigo, where he teaches everybody the things that he learned from Nathan of Gaza, and he writes a small Sabbatean booklet that was published in Sfunot V'Nodalid. And then he goes on various places. He's in Amsterdam, and he is noticed there by some representatives of the young London Sephardic community, which is looking for a Chacham, and they hire him to be the Chacham in London. So that's a pretty nice position, and he spends 10 years as a Chacham in London from 1689 to 1699. We have material that he wrote while he was there. A bunch of it remains in manuscript. strong Sabbatean character, two things that he worked on while he was there. So it wasn't like he stopped being a believer. And in 1699, he is invited by the Amsterdam Sephardic community to come there and be their Chacham. And he is the chief rabbi of the Sephardim in Amsterdam from 1700 until he dies in 1728. That is a plum position and not bad for a Sabbatean, a former Muslim Donmem member and young student of Nathan of Gaza. Meanwhile, his friend, Eliyahu Mojajon, or Mochachion, he leaves Saloniki. He comes to Italy as well. Not clear whether he spends time with Avraham Rovigo. It seems very likely because, like, why wouldn't he? And he ends up becoming the rabbi of the city of Ancona, which is a very ancient and very important Jewish community on the Adriatic coast, which had formerly also had a leading Sabbatean figure as its rabbi, a man whose name, if you can believe this, was Rabbi Mahalal El Hallelujah. So I think there's somebody in between, but he is replaced by Eliyahu Mochajon, another Sabbatean. So that's what Nathan is up to in between Shabbetai's apostasy in 1666 and his own death in 1680.
Interestingly, this Rabbi Mahalalel, was something just published from him in Minhag Nazim? Was that him in the newest volume?
I think you're right. I think there was something in there. It's a poem maybe or a commentary. I think I noticed that too.
Yeah, I'll have to double check that in volume Yud. So interesting. Yeah, I was going to mention Shlomo Ayallon. Now, who obviously not, hopefully, and I don't know when these will be published, but posted, but to discuss with Professor Lishava Kalbach about his involvement, obviously, in the Nechemia Chiyun controversy that erupted in Amsterdam. So, now, obviously, we mentioned Rav Avraham Rovigo a bunch of times, so we probably should get to him. But we could discuss before or after, however you want. We kind of alluded to Shabbetai's death and afterwards, the belief in him after his death, which is really the period of, more so of Rovigo and others. And I guess it was before also. However, you want to discuss a little bit more of that theology or what the further reaction to his death was versus the conversion, or was it not that great, difference?
It was a big difference. I think, as you said before, right, while he was still walking around and you could point him out, right, the believers still had something to hold on to, that he's on some kind of mission among the Klipot, and that it's just a matter of time until he manifests himself as the Mashiach. But after he died, there was a real crisis. So Sabbetai dies in 1676. And the believers all over are really thrown into a crisis. I'm sure that more people left the movement at that point. But the theologians go into high gear. And what's particularly interesting for me is that we have this great information from the Beit Midrash of Avraham Rovigo in Modena in Italy, where we sort of can see exactly what people are doing and saying at that moment and see how they're dealing with the crisis. So what Modena's Beit Midrash was famous for is prophecy. He in his own turn was a sort of a prophet, and he had at least two super important Baalei Magid in his Beit Midrash. Before I tell you about them, I want to just point out the idea of a Magid is almost unknown in the Middle Ages. It comes from Sefer HaTamar. It probably has origins with the Sufis, with Muslims, but I don't know. it starts to show up among the Sefer HaMeshiv circle at the end of the period of Jewish life in Spain. It comes into the Ottoman Empire with Rabbi Yosef Taitatzik, who is a member of the Sefer HaMeshiv circle. His student / associate, Rabbi Yosef Karo, is the most famous Baal Magid, right? And that famous letter of Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz about the appearance of the Magid on Shavuos night, that happened in Nicopolis. And the Magid tells him and his group to move to Eretz Yisrael. That's the origin of the group in Tzfat, right? Which is why there were all these Kabbalists in Tzfat, right? Nathan of Gaza has manuscripts of Rabbi Yosef Taitatzik about the Magid. He learns the idea of a Magid. He becomes a Baal Magid. Then there are Magidim in Cardoso's circle, and in short, something that had been a very rare phenomenon up until then explodes among the Sabbateans. So there are Magidim all over the place among the Sabbateans, and the ones in the Beit Midrash of Rav Avraham Rovigo are among the most famous and most influential. So, of course, Rabbi Avraham Rovigo's closest friend is Rabbi Benjamin HaKohen, who seems to be the conduit through which the idea of the Magid reaches the Ramchal. So that's kind of the chain of transmission as far as I can put it together. Now, the first, as Yeshaya Tishbi proved, right, using some very subtle work on the manuscript material, some really excellent scholarly work, he determined that the first Magid in the Beit Midrash of Avraham Rovigo was a fantastic character named Ber Perelhefter. Ber Perelhefter was a person who was teaching Hebrew to some of the most important Christian Hebraists of the period. His wife, Bella Perelhefter, was a famous Jewish woman author. I first learned about her from Elisheva Karlbach. Since then, a bunch of material has been published. Ber and Bella Perelhefter wrote a book together in Yiddish. He was a rabbi in Mantova. He was a rabbi in Prague. And he was a Baal Magid in the Beis Medrash of Rabbi Avraham Rovigo. And he is there at the moment when the news, or just after the moment that the news of Sabbatai's death comes through. And he, through his Magid tells him, here's what's going to happen. He's going to come back soon, and this is what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen. And Avraham Rovigo takes this information that he's getting through the Magid of Ber Perelhefter, and he's telling everybody about it, right? There's a whole network of Sabbateans, and they pass messages to each other. And Rabbi Meir HaRofeh, who was there at the moment when Nathan of Gaza had his first Magid episode on Shavuos night in 1665, he rejects what Ber Perelhefter's Magid is saying. He claims it's not a real Magid, and maybe it's Klipa and Sitra Achra and who knows what. And there's a big argument that ensues. But it's very interesting to get the sense of, right, how people are seeing this moment. So if I recall correctly, the Magid tells them that they should stop saying the tikkunim, right? They should return to saying the tikkunim of the Arizal, which they had stopped during the period of Sabbetai, right? In other words, they should sort of normalize again in certain ways, but still not in other ways, so on. So he is the first Magid. He leaves, and a number of years later, another man comes to the Beis Medrash of Avraham Rovigo. His name is Mordechai Ashkenazi of Zolkiev, and he's an Ashkenazi, poorly educated. He had been some sort of a low-level court Jew back in Poland, and Avram Rovigo sort of mentors him and tutors him and tries to improve his Hebrew and his understanding of the Zohar and all kinds of things like that. And meanwhile, Mordechai Ashkenazi, also becomes a Baal Magid. He starts to be visited by a Magid which, from the psychological point of view, is super interesting because it looks just like Avram Rovigo, except that it has a white beard. Anyway, he has experiences with this Magid for years and years and years. Rovigo left a notebook, right? It's really Mordechai Ashkenazi's notebook of what the Magid is telling him, and in the margins are the comments of Avram Rovigo. This goes on for years, and again, a lot of the discussion is what's going to happen now? What's going to happen with Sabbetai Tzvi? Is he coming back? When's he going to come back? Who is Mashiach ben David? Who is Mashiach ben Yosef? Which is another huge topic of discussion, especially for the Polish Jews. For some reason, they are absolutely occupied with this question of who's Mashiach ben Yosef. And there are a bunch of candidates from various places in Poland at different times. And so the discussion goes on right after Sabbatai's death. It goes on for years, and people keep proposing new dates, right? Somebody will say, he's definitely coming back in 1675 or 1682 or whatever the date is, and they keep revising the dates, and people you would think would eventually give up, and I'm sure that some of them do, but the hardcore continue to believe. And it is super interesting watching them sort of struggle the cognitive dissonance as they try to figure out how they should act now. Is the Mashiach coming back soon? Is it going to be later? So on.
So we made mention already there from Rovigo and Nathan of Gaza and briefly of Cardozo. One that I alluded to, we haven't really discussed much, and a movement that's a little bit jumping forward a little bit. So if you have something on the others, you can mention, but is Yehuda Chasid, who makes Aliyah, and he goes to Yerushalayim with him together with another leader, right, Chaim Malach. So I guess discuss that movement a little, and many may not know the Sabbetai and I guess underpinnings of that movement. What happened there?
Right. Super interesting. Okay, so first of all, I will tell you that Rabbi Yehuda Chasid or Chasid is a figure from the 12th century, right? Ashkenaz. This man's name is Yehuda Chasid. So if you take away the definite article, it's easier to remember the difference between them, or whatever that's worth. Okay, so I'm going to put him aside for a moment and talk about this other figure that you mentioned, Chaim Malach. So Chaim Malach is a brilliant and highly educated Polish rabbi and Kabbalist. And he's interesting to follow because in some ways he kind of exemplifies this generation of the 1680s and 90s of Sabbatean believers. So he reads whatever material from Nathan of Gaza he can get his hands on in Poland. He leaves Poland and comes, of all places, to Italy, right? And he goes apparently briefly to Avram Rovigo, and then he goes to the Rabbah, for Binyamin HaKohen of Reggio, and he spends a lot of time with the Rabbah. The Rabbah becomes kind of his Rebbe, really, in these matters. spends a lot of time and studies with him. And from there, he gets all kinds of writings of Nathan of Gaza that he didn't have in Poland. And he goes back to Poland and he brings these writings with him and he teaches his fellow Polish rabbis about all these new teachings of Nathan of Gaza. He then leaves Poland again and he goes to the Ottoman Empire. And there he studies with Cardoso. And you'll remember that Cardoso highly, very strongly teaches that Jewish believers in Sabbetai should stay Jewish and they should stay Shomrei Mitzvot, and they shouldn't become antinomians, that is to say, people who stop keeping the halacha, right? So Malach studies with him for quite a while, and then he goes to study with Shmuel Primo, who had been Sabbatai's secretary, who was very close with Sabbetai. He had, meanwhile, Primo had become highly radicalized. He never joined those who left Judaism. He never converted, and in fact, he was the rabbi of Edirne. But he taught a much more radical version of Sabbatean theology. And I think that he was much more antinomian. That is to say, he believed in these ritual transgressions of halacha. So after studying with him, Malach became radicalized in that way. And he again returned to Poland. And he brought all these ideas with him. So he makes the rounds, right, of the Sabbatean cells in Italy and the Ottoman Empire and brings all these ideas back to Poland, where there is apparently a good audience for all this material. One of the people that he brings over to the radical version of Sabbatean teachings from Primo in Poland is Yehuda Chasid. Yehuda Chasid and Chaim Malach, right, are now kind of the leaders of a cell or a group. And they feel that the next big move in the Sabbatean awakening or the manifestation is to bring a lot of Jews to Eretz Yisrael, to make a big Aliyah movement. And so they start out in Poland. They go through various areas in Eastern Europe, then into Germany, Western Europe, and everywhere they go, they pick up supporters. Now, they are not announcing publicly that this is a Sabbatean project, but they are both deep and radical Sabbateans, and many of the people who join their group as it grows and snowballs going through Europe are Sabbateans. Certain people recognize this and they try to stop this group, but nobody wants to take the initiative because what a great thing, a huge group of Jews moving to Eretz Yisrael, who wants to stop that? So nobody will stop it, even though some people really know the Sabbatean character, at least of leadership and many of the members of the group. So it's a long story and quite complicated, but they bring a large group. Some people had said 1,000 or more than 1,000. It may not have been that many, but certainly several hundred Jews. And they eventually arrive in Yerushalayim, at which time Rabbi Yehuda Chasid, who is this fiery and highly, what's the word I need, magnetic darshan and so on, he promptly dies within days of their arrival in Yerushalayim. Now, Yerushalayim is a complicated place to be because it has an Ottoman governor who is very rapacious and takes every penny that he can squeeze out of the Jews and Christians who live in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim also has an existing Sephardic community, which is barely hanging on by its fingernails because of this governor, right? and there are some Ashkenazim there as well. So now this big new group comes, and they got nothing. They're not coming with money. They're dirt poor, right? And now they just sort of dropped into Yerushalayim, and the governor thinks that he's going to squeeze more money out of this new and large community, and the finances of the community just collapse, and it's a big disaster. Chaim Malach is in charge of this group, right? Once Yehuda Chasid dies, right, various complicated things happen, but they essentially take over the Ashkenazi community in Yerushalayim. Now, another thing that happens a couple of years after they arrive is that Avraham Rovigo from Italy shows up to join them. And that's a good thing for them because he's quite wealthy. He brings a bunch of money with him. So he becomes an important figure in the establishment of the Yerushalayim Ashkenazi community. This group, the Chasid group, builds a shul, builds a synagogue for themselves in Yerushalayim. Now, it was not called the Churva when they built it. It's sort of like I tell my students, when you visit Rome, everywhere you go, there are ruins. And I've never quite figured out why the ancient Romans loved building ruins. I don't know. Why didn't they build nice buildings? The Churva, what became the Churva was destroyed later under various circumstances. But that was originally the project of this quasi-Sabbatean group under Chaim Malach and Yehuda Chasid. So when you go and visit the Churva in the old city of Yerushalayim, just remember that was a Sabbatean project originally. Eventually, the European supporters of the Malach and Chasid group, who include Rav David Oppenheim, find out that the community is essentially ruled over by Sabbatean believers, and they yank their support, and these people are sort of thrown out, and they go various places. One of the most radical groups of Sabbateans leaving right from the original Hasid Malach group, leaving Yerushalayim, goes to Mannheim in Germany, and they're really radical Sabbatean theologians and believers. One of the people who drops by to visit them there is one of Yonasan Eibeshitz, but that's a whole different story. Yeah.
So that took a little bit of a detour into the Yehuda Chasid story. Just it figures worth bringing up, as that ends he died in 1700, so that's
right.
Kind of till there. So just one other thing I wanted, as we finish up, I wanted to mention. I think is worth mentioning, and we've kind of alluded to this, but we haven't exactly. I don't think said this emphatically. That we mentioned a couple figures from radical, Cardozo and Nathan of Gaza, and the like, and then Rav Avraham Rovigo and Rabbi Yamin Cohen. So Vitali. So there is. From basically the belief, the rabbinic figures, the theology, you have figures obviously that are radical, heretics, apikosim, and then you have rabbanim like the Rabbach that are considered by many a big Talmud Chacham. So they weren't all believing. I don't know what the right way to put it. They weren't all believing the same thing, right? There was a little bit. You just want to explore this. There was a little bit of a difference, going on here between the different kind of figures, right?
There are enormous differences in what people believe. I do want to correct one thing, though. There are radicals who are enormous Talmidei Chachamim. There are very conservative people who believe in a very moderate version, and people who don't believe in any of it, who are not Talmidei Chachamim at all. In other words, all flavors of this movement in this period, the late 17th, beginning of the 18th century, all flavors of the movement contain people who are enormous Talmidei Chachamim and people who are moderate Talmidei Chachamim and people who are ignorant. And in that statement, I want to include the Dolmeh, the people who converted to Islam in Saloniki, some of the most important rabbis in the community converted to Islam with the Dolmeh. So that's as far as that goes. Now, there are sort of two directions that this takes. There's the question, so there's been a lot of discussion. Pavel Macheko has been very interested in this question of heresy and what the Sabbateans were doing, believing, what it meant in this period and into the early and middle part of the 18th century. It's clear that, well, wow, that was going to come out weird. It's clear that it's unclear. It's all very foggy, and even the difference between apostates and people who stay within Judaism, as we saw with Shlomo Ayallon, can be very tricky to understand. But there's clearly no simple difference between radical and moderate Sabbateans. And there's no simple way to say, oh, here's how you tell what's a moderate, here's how you tell what's a radical. So this has been a topic of discussion and a bunch of recent scholarship. So even though Sholem talks about moderates and radicals, it's not clear cut. Sometimes Sholem seems to be saying that radical Sabbateans are the ones who abandon Judaism, and moderates are the ones who stay within Judaism. But that doesn't seem right either, because of the ones who stay within Judaism, there are some who have very radical theologies. These tripartite God ideas or two-part God ideas. And that's the type of thing where Nehemiah Chayon becomes really radical. And then there are more moderate forms of the theology, but there are also different attitudes toward the keeping of the mitzvot. There are people like Rovigo who keeps everything, is a very pious, very intense Shomer Mitzvot Jew. It is possible that he is not keeping Tisha B'Av as a fast. That's the one thing that might not be going on there. There are other people who are ritual antinomians, like this guy they catch in Zlotchov, I think. They will eat, for example, exactly a kizayit of bread on Pesach. So it's clear that they're not doing that out of enjoyment, that they are imitating Sabbetai Tzvi's strange actions as Ma'asim Zarim, right, in a very specific way, not throwing off the yoke of the mitzvot, but doing these ritual antinomian acts. And then there are people who are doing radical actions, right, like Sabbetai and Sarah, and a lot of the Dolmeh, who throw out entirely the sort of ethical laws, the laws about sexual morality and so on. Baruchia Russo, who is one of the leaders of one of the groups of the Dolmeh, takes all of the mitzvot that are karet, right, and isur kares from the Torah, and he says these are exactly opposite, right? The mitzvah is to break these laws. So there are radical actions, radical attitudes toward mitzvot, and moderate attitudes. There are radical ideas, and more moderate ideas. And sometimes you will find somebody who is practicing a radical version of the mitzvot, of breaking mitzvot, but has moderate theology, or has radical theology, but isn't a person breaking mitzvot, and so on, right? The mix and match. There's no sort of there's nothing that would appear to us to be a logical way of arranging these people. They have very different attitudes toward mitzvot. They have very different attitudes toward theology, and whether the Mashiach is deified or not deified, whether you keep the moral commandments or not, so on. So it's a big mess.
Yeah, and thank you for the clarification. I think I mainly meant what you said at the end there, was Shomer Mitzvahs and someone who wasn't. And just to mainly draw the distinction that you kind of made, that they weren't all the same, exactly in the same boat. There was distinctions here amongst them. So I think we should briefly mention, just in passing almost, that I will hopefully do episodes separately on these, that obviously after this, I mean, I guess there is at some point, we'll just call it the Emden Eibishitz controversy, and then there is the Franks, and then you already mentioned a couple of times the Dunma. So Emden Eibishitz, I did an episode a while back with Pavel Macheko, and then I hope to do one with Pavel about the Franks, Jacob Frank and the Frank movement, as well as the Dunma. So we did mention those. So obviously there's a lot more to talk about with this, and we will not cover everything in however many hours. So I think, with that, I think, what would be suggested reading material? I know there is, especially, we were discussing this before we started recording, and especially on this period after, Shapsi's conversion and then his death, and then after that, until you get to Frank, there really is a lack of English, I guess, material. But I mean, what reading material in English can you suggest anybody interested in exploring this more in depth?
Okay, so there's a book by Gershom Scholem that's just called Kabbalah, that contains a lot of articles about topics and people in the history of Kabbalah in general, and it's got a lot of interesting material about people connected with the Sabbatean movement and ideas of the Sabbatean. So that is an excellent place to start. There are 3 volumes of primary sources that we were talking about earlier. David Halpern has published a volume of primary sources about Avram Miguel Cardoso, and another volume of sources from the movement in general. Different kinds of sources, very well translated, very useful. I believe that, I won't try and remember which presses those come out of, but yeah.
The Halpern one on Testimonies to Fallen Messiah is Littman, and I'll include the link, and I'll find the other one from him as well.
Okay, good. And then Pavel Macheko and I think some of his students have published a small volume. It's got a title, something like Sabbatean Heresy, which is, again, more translated documents. That is an excellent collection also, but I will say that it skews toward the radical and the heretical at the expense of a discussion about the more moderate and let's say mitzvah observant versions of Sabbateanism in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Having said that, though, again, a terrific collection of primary sources. There's a small book by Alexander van der Haven that was published, I think, by the Menashe Ben Israel Institute about Sarah, the wife of the Messiah. And then Brandon Marriott wrote a very interesting book about non-Jewish writings about Sabbetai Tzvi and the movement, and a lot of the material that moved around in Christian circles. So that's very interesting. And as you mentioned, the later chapters of the big Gershom Sholem book, Sabbetai Tzvi. I would say also the volumes of Sifunot, which is a journal, it comes out in big hardcover volumes, but there are several of those volumes in Hebrew that contain lots of material about all of this, but they do have at the back English précis or abstracts, and so you can actually gain a lot by reading just those abstracts, a page or two from each article. So if there's a particular subject that you want to know about and you don't want to read the long Hebrew articles, there are English abstracts in Sfunot.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, the book edited by Pavel is Brandeis University Press. I'll try to link to these books in the show's notes. Feel free to email me as well with any questions. Also, we forgot to mention, or you, I don't know if on purpose left out, your academia page has a number of articles, especially about Rovigo and other articles that you've written as well on this time period, if anyone wants to check out, right?
Okay, thank you.
So that's I can include that as well in the link. And then there's just in your book, the Sabbatean prophets. There's a small final chapter on this period. And obviously in Hebrew there's a lot, but there's just endless. I don't know if there's anything specific. There's just a lot there, so we'll just leave it to the English sources. So okay, thank you very much for joining me, and hopefully this.
If I can just throw in a plug, right? Among the great Hebrew sources, and there's a tremendous amount. There's a recent Hebrew University PhD dissertation by Noam Leffler, which is outstanding, and he's also edited a couple of volumes of material by let's see, he's working on the Athini, and he's published material from Chazan. This is primary source material from the movement. So if you are interested and you read Hebrew, he's terrific.
Right, and obviously, like I said, I didn't even get the Dunme books and the Frank. The listeners should be on the lookout for those episodes of the podcast where I'll get more into that. So with that, thank you, Professor Goldish, for joining me. I hope the listeners found this enlightening, and I hope that they made it through these 2 lengthy episodes. And I hope this was, taught them a little bit something about, I think a lot of people know about Sabbetai Tzvi. They've heard about him, but maybe don't know more about the story and the theology and the history, what exactly went on. So hopefully this taught them a little bit.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.